My name's Ted Cacci. I'm the director of the Center for Italian Studies, and it's a great joy for me to be here, to be able to welcome you to, this is the 11th edition of our annual Italian Studies Research Seminar. So it's amazing how time flies. I just want to welcome you on behalf of the center. We have a wonderful program this year. You've seen the posters. On October 6th, we're going to have Jessica, please come back. We're going to have Jessica L. Harris of St. John's University, who's going to speak a wonderful title, Permettereste a vostra figlia di sposare Lola, Latent Fascism, American Culture, and Blackness in Post-War Italy. And I'm delighted to tell you that there are no Dante lectures. Oh, there is one in the spring. Oh, I was going to say, after 21, we had overload of Dante lectures. So I was really impressed with the lineup that has been prepared for us for this year by my esteemed colleague, Charles Levitt, the Associate Director of the Center for Italian Studies, who is responsible for the curation of the research seminar this year. So I want to thank Charles and pass the word to him to do the honors this evening. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, so I get to introduce our speaker. And as Ted said, I'm Charles Levitt. I'm an associate professor of Italian and film and the associate director of the Center for Italian Studies. And our first lecture in this Italian Research Seminar series for this academic year is entitled, as you'll see here, How Contini Worked, the Critic's Scartafacci. And as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I did check, I think this might be the first Italian Research Seminar we've had dedicated to Contini. And I'm glad Contini's been a presence, I think, from the start on our graduate exam reading lists, but it hasn't been something that we've gathered together to discuss in this way. And I was thinking a bit about maybe why that's the case. Why we haven't had a lecture on Contini. And I thought back to a line from Clive James's Invaluable Cultural Amnesia, where he talks about how Contini's prose could be so compact that even his best students had trouble picking it apart. And then goes on to say, Contini, even for the Italians, has a reputation as a scrittore difficile, and to translate his major critical articles into English, he says, would be a task for heroes. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're in the presence of a hero. Because Ryan Pepin, who's our speaker today, is not just a student or a scholar of Contini's work, but he's also Contini's translator. And he's in the process, as we speak, of translating Contini's essays into English for publication. In addition to being a hero, Ryan Pepin is visiting assistant professor of Italian at Notre Dame. He's joined us this fall from a number of posts. He was at the universities of Cambridge and Oxford. He obtained his PhD with a thesis on Dante and metricology in 2020, and since then he's held research fellowships in Austria and Italy, most recently at the Fondazione Ezio Franceschini in Florence, where he was Marco Pralulan Fellow. He's working on two books, so it's not just the heroic book of translations of essays by the Italian critic and philologist Gianfranco Contini, but also a book on rhythmical figures in Dante. So please join me in welcoming our speaker, Ryan Pepin.
Thank you so much for those kind words. I'm your relief that Dante is not on the program for this year, I'm afraid is going to be very short-lived. There's a fair amount of Dante in what I'm about to give. Thank you so much for your kind words. Let me thank also the Notre Dame Center for Italian Studies and the Medieval Institute and Professor Levitt for the invitation and the very, very kind introduction. For the invitation to start off the Italian Research Seminar this year. It's an honor to be invited to offer something of my work while I'm here at Notre Dame, and doubly an honor to be given a chance to get some feedback on a critical experiment that I've been developing alongside my work on Dante for some years. This is, as befits the seminar, work in progress, but what I have to present today is also about work in progress, about a scholar's drafts, about Gianfranco Contini's process of editing, about the elaboration of his thoughts, about the change in the way he expressed them in what became, when it was finally published, perhaps Contini's finest piece of work, or at least he said as much in a late life interview. This was the essay entitled An Interpretation of Dante, Un'interpretazione di Dante. I expected some Italianists might show up today, but it's a particular pleasure to see other faces in the room. As this is also a talk about a figure who deserves much wider recognition in the English-speaking world and beyond. And as I certainly don't want to assume that all of my audience will know who Gianfranco Contini is, I'm going to start my story today with some names that you most likely will know. Contini was a romance philologist, which is to say that he was primarily, or rather professionally, a textual critic and a historical linguist. Unlike most romance philologists, however, his place at the center of Italian 20th century letters and his role in setting taste and direction for Italian intellectual culture on a whole cannot really be overstated. One question that will naturally emerge in the next 50 minutes is why this figure has been placed back into the academic closure he so remarkably vaulted out of in his lifetime. But first, here is Pasolini as a witness to Contini's cultural influence. In the first part of Pasolini's collection of poems, La religione del mio tempo, the religion of my time, he writes about his presumably youthful encounter with Pasolini's work. In the poem La ricchezza del sapere, the wealth of knowledge, Pasolini writes that instead of money, I had, on the other hand, libraries, galleries, instruments for every kind of study. There was within my soul, born for passions, already the whole San Francesco in shining reproductions, and the San Sepolcro fresco, and the one in Monturchi, all of Piero, almost a symbol of ideal mastery if he was the object of the love of masters, Longhi or Contini. In general, throughout, I'll place the Italian text on the screen and read my own English translations. Note that what Pasolini is saying here is more specific than that he was able to recall the Arezzo True Cross cycle, the Resurrection, and the Madonna del Parto, because he had seen them reproduced in the art historian Roberto Longhi's famous study of Piero della Francesca. He is saying something more specific, that Piero was a kind of wealth because he was the object of scholarly devotion, se oggetto, of the kind that a Longhi or a Contini lavished on his work, an ideale possesso. Longhi and Contini were in fact good friends, and Contini was deeply influenced by the former's skill in attributing names to anonymous works. In Pasolini's poem, it is these scholars' attentions that constitutes the inheritance, the wealth that the poet claims, rather than the frescoes themselves. Possesso can mean a possession, but also self-possession, composure, and it is this second that Pasolini takes. Pasolini remained forever in Contini's debt. He and Contini exchanged letters for years, and Pasolini even sent some of the poems that make up La ricchezza to Contini in 1953. He published others from that collection in the literary journal that Roberto Longhi founded, Paragone, in the late 1950s. This ought to serve to give a cursory sense of the centrality of a figure like Contini to Italian intellectual life in the last century, just as Pasolini's poem grants priority to the academic philologist and art historian over the visual artist Piero. Pasolini himself lived under the spell of this particular academic philologist for his whole life. But Contini's enduring influence over Pasolini, and indeed the mention of Roberto Longhi's journal Paragone, also bring me right to the work I want to discuss today. Contini and Pasolini were due to meet in December 1964. Both had accepted invitations to speak at the Italian Cultural Association in Turin on December 11th as part of a conference organized to kick off the centenary year, a conference entitled Dante e Noi, Dante and Us. The following year, 1965, was the previous 7th Dante centenary, that is the 700th year anniversary of his birth last year. Of course, we celebrated the 7th centenary of his death. On December 5th, in a letter to Giulio Einaudi, the famous publisher, Contini writes to say that Pasolini has cancelled, And questo rientra nelle regole del suo gioco. And that's part of the rules of his game. Contini penned a letter to Pasolini the following day, December 6th. In it, he asks Pasolini if he might, by way of recompense perhaps, be interested in giving a talk in the coming year on the theme Io e Dante. Moravia is interested, Contini says. Contini then gives a synopsis of an idea he's been developing about Dante. He writes, in any case, my principal thesis is that the Commedia has two states, one when it is read slowly, of sublime photograms, the best the language has ever produced, and one when it is read quickly, an implausible and alien libretto, save for the constant drive to lay hold of reality. What is most curious is that I thought something similar about your Matthew, Pasolini's film, The Gospel According to Matthew. So if you want, I've got the documents ready on me to take up the presidency of the Italian Pasolini Society. Pasolini will later claim that in this letter, Contini planted in him a seed, out of which grew his own ill-fated intervention into the criticism of Dante's works. Over the next 10 months, between the winter of 1964, the winter of the Turin Conference, and October of 1965, Contini developed the ideas that he summarizes here to Pasolini into an essay he would publish in Roberto Longhi's journal, Paragone, an essay entitled An Interpretation of Dante. This is the essay. This is my critical object today. One moment. All right. To give some sense of the splash it made, my apologies. By December of the same centenary year, just 2 months after the essay was published, Pasolini could already refer to Contini's work as an ormai famoso saggio, a now famous essay. Also in December, Pasolini published in the same journal an essay entitled La volontà di Dante a essere poeta, why Dante wanted to become a poet, more or less. Taking over many of Contini's ideas, but advancing an idea of Dante's stylistic equidistance. A fracas ensued. Pasolini's essay was bitterly attacked, not by Contini himself, but by Contini's student, Cesare Segre, in the same issue, in an essay entitled La volontà di Pasolini a essere dantista. Pasolini appended a postscriptum to his own essay, confessing that he had misunderstood Contini, that he had gone malamente oltre, senza passaporto, senza patente, senza lascia passare con un mandato di cattura, poorly beyond, without a passport, license, permit, with an arrest warrant. The story is brilliantly told by Michela Mastrodonato, who analyzes Pasolini's efforts to chiedere venia per il peccato di cattiva interpretazione di Contini, by taking over, in his apology cum defense, many of Contini's turns of phrase. This mixture of white-hot enthusiasm and interpretive bewilderment can be found in another of the essay's notable readers. Here's what Italo Calvino has to say about Contini's interpretation of Dante in a letter to François Val, also from the winter of '65. In the issue of Paragone that has the Ferrata article, Contini's essay on Dante seems to me a marvel of intelligence and scientificity and method and wealth, ricchezza, Pasolini's word, and expressivity and lyricism and smoke and mirrors and humor and historical heft and fun. Too bad that Contini's elusive writing is almost untranslatable and that his Chinese box method is difficult to appreciate for those who don't know him. Calvino did indeed know him. In the previous winter, Calvino had written to Contini to ask if Contini wouldn't mind writing a review of his work, magari in un angolo di un scritto che parla d'altro, perhaps in the corner of some piece that's about something else. His admiration for the critic, as appears from this letter, grew upon reading this essay into a kind of apophatic gushing. This is now the second suggestion that Contini's essay was electrifying, but also that it defied summary, even easy interpretation. Calvino says this explicitly. The essay which he read was, he writes, difficile. This is an adjective that will not surprise anyone who has read Contini, and it is one that has attached to Contini's writing from the beginning. Reviewing Contini's 1942 essay collection, Un anno di letteratura, in the pages of Primato, a fascist cultural journal, Walter Bini wrote about the difficoltà non arbitraria di questo lavoro critico, the non-arbitrary difficulty of this critical work. Bewildering for the quantity of references that it presupposes, always full of not wholly explained abridged deductions. This is, to be clear, a compliment. Bini sensed a necessary difficulty in Contini's prose, that had difficulties with that had affinities rather with interwar Florentine Hermeticism, but was, he thought, more justified, more motivated in its choice of an obscure style. 20 years later, that sense of difficulty is still there in Calvino's letter, particularly Bini's sense of missing connectors. You have to know him, Calvino says, to know what his methodology is trying to adduce. What exactly did this famous essay, this piece which rewrote Pasolini into a collision course with academic dantismo and which drew this list of marvelous attributes from Calvino's pen, have to say about Dante? An interpretation of Dante consists in about 40 pages of reflection on how memory works in Dante. The essay is an argument about the memorableness of Dante's style and the way this memorableness in turn produced scribal errors. It then offers a catalogue of lines in which Dante remembers his own turn of phrase and reuses it, as well as a catalogue of lines in which Petrarch did the same, and then a catalogue of lines in which Dante then seems to recollect lines from an unattributed pair of poems known as the Fiore and Detto d'Amore, and hence an attributional claim. All this is capped by an extended reflection on the kind of realism that Dantean style produces. I won't today expand much further on the argument of an interpretation of Dante. What I would like to focus on instead is what has already come to the fore in this pair of encounters with the essay, Contini's own electrifying but very difficult style. It is this that I want to give an account of, because it and the difficulties it raised have been pointed to twice, and it has a unique, even marvelous nature, according to Calvino. So to talk about style, let us make first a historical digression. Studying style, critica stilistica, Stilkritik, is not much done, at least not much done under that banner nowadays. And this is perhaps because there is a question as to whether studying style on its own is possible, studying the technique or the form of expression without the content of expression. At least something like that is the anxiety that sat behind a fierce critical debate about studying style in the Italian post-war period. Contini could write already in the 30s, when he was in his 20s, ogni posizione stilistica, o addirittura direi grammaticale, è una posizione gnosiologica. Every stylistic or grammatical position is epistemological. This, while importing a very fine-grained German language Stilkritik associated with Leo Spitzer, did not yet amount to saying anything controversial. Slowly, however, in the 40s, this changed. The way Contini, a trained Lachmanian or reconstructive philologist, sought to approach the question of style, beginning with an essay from the late 1930s entitled Come lavorava Ariosto, How Ariosto Worked, began to make use of authorial drafts to discuss style as something visible in and as work, an end perpetually in fieri, dynamically sought after as an author developed and amended their work. This methodological innovation, the use of drafts, an innovation which Contini was careful to disclaim, and which in fact had already risen to prominence in France, is what produced the conflict. Studying its development in draft form seems to suggest that style has something less than a necessary relationship to artistic invention, or the ideal genesis of the work of art, to use the Crocean term. Benedetto Croce himself entered the fray to chastise those who rummaged through Scartafacci, rough drafts, accusing them of being decadents, incapable of gathering together in meditation on works of art, art's relation to the life of the spirit. In his Aesthetics, Croce approvingly cites a little-known 19th century source to the effect that style is merely a consequence of the principal idea of a work of art. For Croce, What one could see in drafts was not a record of the development of authorial style, but something else, perhaps an author's placeholders, his or her frustrations surely, but no information on the success of invention, which took place somewhere else. Contini penned a response which he did not publish, emphasizing that the detection of a direction of travel in emendation or a programmatic system of correction suggested what an author was working towards, and this did not contradict the ideal genesis of the art object, indeed implied it. The story of this rupture has been told often, but the two positions it outlines, it seems to me, are relevant today. I am not the first to propose Contini's style as an object of study. But to my knowledge, the specific method which Contini introduced to the study of style, the use of authorial drafts, has not been turned on its maker. A recent, excellent, though brief essay by Paolo Italia discusses the unpublished draft of Contini's response to Croce regarding the so-called Critica degli Scartafacci. It highlights a set of variants, but the question of Contini's style is not posed. To guide, however, today's foray into the archive, it will be more than useful to have a sense of orientation. We have already gleaned some sense of Contini's characteristic style from Pasolini, and especially from Calvino. Let me pick up where I left off with Calvino's letter, the summary of Contini's marvelous but difficult style. The letter is more eloquent still. In the sentence beginning peccato, Contini alludes directly to the text of Contini's Dante essay twice. In the first instance, he refers to Contini's Chinese box methodology. This is how Contini, as it so happens, at the end of an interpretation of Dante, characterizes Dante's epigrammatic style. For Dante, by contrast, who always aims at movement, a state of mind flashes instantaneously but does not coagulate. For the most part, these natural epigrams, so arresting in their peremptoriness, possess no formal autonomy of any kind. Firefly, graduate, geometer, etc., are similes, or at any rate metaphors. Not content to sit on the page in the service of something else, they load themselves down like Chinese boxes with parentheses and incidentals, not all of which are lyrically salient. Dante's style is epigrammatic, but paradoxically these moments possess no formal autonomy. They are not actually prize-outable, but dissolve into the flow of further and further considerations. So roughly, what Calvino remembers about Contini's essay, with the words of Contini's essay, is a style that is digressive but still seems solid, another one of his words. The style seems to work by flashes of insight. Lo stato d'animo folgora istantaneamente, ma non si coagula. Calvino uses another adjective to describe Contini's style. Almost untranslatable. I'm, as you can imagine, particularly fond of this way of characterizing Contini's prose because I have been translating Contini into English for the past couple of years, and I am tempted sometimes to agree. Calvino, in his letter, is writing to a French publisher, and so untranslatable here means I'd recommend him to your publishing house, Éditions du Seuil, the publisher of both Barthes and Lacan, but I can't, he's too difficult. The question of translatability, however, is also remembered from Contini's essay. It is there at the beginning of an interpretation of Dante when Contini summarizes his argument as follows. In other words, if there is a criterion with which to measure the fraught category which is a poet's greatness, it can only be his translatability. His translatability in particular from one cultural system to another. This is remembered in the negative, as though Contini, perhaps more than refusing linguistic translation, refuses translation from one cultural system to another. Recall, Calvino is writing to a French publisher. Let's see if, when we look at the drafts and reworkings of this essay, we can say something then about these Chinese boxes and about translation. What I found, beginning to delve into the pre-publication versions of Contini's essay in the Gianfranco Contini archive in Florence, was that translation, both linguistic and from one cultural system to another, was precisely the task out of which this famous but untranslatable essay grew. Calvino would have been surprised to discover that the untranslatable essay he read was in fact arrived at through a process of translation, that between December 1964, when we see the first traces of it in the letter to Pasolini, and October 1965, when it is published in Paragone, Contini's piece went through multiple versions and even multiple media, and was translated into English, French, German, and Hungarian. Contini toured the world with it, presenting it in his role as president of the Società Dantesca Italiana in Montreal, Vienna, Budapest, and potentially also in Malta. I'm not sure about that one. The essay's concern with translatability, especially from one cultural system to another, is also a reflection of and on the uses of this first version. They were created to suit the demands of public engagement in foreign countries. Only in its last stage could the work be said to refuse translation, and that makes for a sharp stylistic inversion. Let me start to build an early timeline. On January 26th of the new year, 1965, a month or so after the Turin Conference and the Pasolini letter, Contini gave another talk in Florence at the Centro Incontro per Stranieri, a welcome center and language teaching institute for foreigners. We have a transcript of this version, a verbal transcript of this version. Elements of the final version are there, including the catalog of reused turns of phrase in Dante's oeuvre, Dante's auto memory. On this occasion, however, the essay is framed with a pair of introductory questions, a dichotomy that, though contained in it, certainly no longer does the work of initial setup in the final version. Due domande generali provenienti da parte opposte dell'orizzonte culturale si pongono, mi sembra, a proposito di Dante. Dante è un poeta popolare? Dante è un classico? Question mark. There are two general questions which emerge, it seems to me, regarding Dante, and which arise from opposite ends of the cultural horizon. Is Dante a popular poet? Is Dante a classic? We learn from Contini's opening remarks in this talk why he is asking this question, moreover. And this has everything to do with translation, especially from one cultural system to another. Here's how Contini introduces the January talk. Recently, I found myself undertaking a task which I feel privileged to undertake. The National Library in Florence is organizing, at the behest of a national committee, an exhibition of books and other documents related to Dante, and I am examining the dozens and hundreds of books of the Commedia that are conserved here in Florence in order to make a selection. And the exceedingly patient and courteous attendants bring them to my desk, 10 at a time, so they can be examined up close, elbow to elbow. Superb pieces, extremely valuable exemplars, written on choice parchment and elegantly illuminated, written in beautiful bookhands, and paper manuscripts of no value, copied down by lay brothers or copied down by merchants recently redeemed from illiteracy. What we learn from this early January talk is that Contini spent January of 1965 in the great libraries of Florence preparing a mostra, an exhibition of manuscripts, as a part of the celebrations of the Dante centenary that year. The exhibition in the Biblioteca Nazionale opened on the 20th of April. To Contini personally, beginning in January, fell the task of selecting manuscripts to be included in the exhibition. As he worked on the selection of manuscripts, ideas of how to frame the exhibition and to make sense of the material for the public began to develop. The idea which he began to settle on, and which you can see in outline here, was to show the diversity of manuscript witnesses, from the luxe illuminated codices to humble, unpretentious paper copies, as illustrative of the poet's equal belonging to high and low culture. As with many of Contini's direct sources for his ideas, this is later suppressed, but in this version, he at one point cites Adorno and his concept of Mezzocultura, Halbbildung, by name. Here is how this point is expressed in the final version. Again, I will read from my translation. These insufferable shopkeepers, Franco Sacchetti and co., who betray the extent to which Dante and his enormous syncretism is excessive, even in its basic premises, were unable to fathom both Dante's true popular appeal and his true erudition. His popular appeal, on the one hand, which also involves the ossature of playbills, of intense color contrasts, of rhythm hurtling along a proliferating chain, and hence vocal, I was about to say Verdian repertoire, but his erudition, on the other, because even the most intense of his formal energies is not pure nature, shorn of precedent and paradigm, but belongs, notionally, to the claims that rimatori, as Vita Nova calls them, make to the status and prerogatives of poets. What were at first two simple, clear questions has now become a much more elaborate interpretive puzzle. You can see better now the arrival point. Dante's popularity here is explained with high modernist indirection in a succession of three images: playbills, chromaticism, Verdian repertoire. As an aside, I have spent hours on this sentence and cannot even now be sure if I know what ossitura di cartellone means, or indeed chromaticità violenta. It could be either visual or musical, all suggestions welcome. To get back to where we were. The argument of an interpretation of Dante, which begins here and settles on the topic of memory, including the national memory of Dante, emerges surprisingly from an exhibition curator's problem of how to best select and arrange material for display. This is what Contini was doing in January, and so the exhibition, in a sense, is a further version of this essay, or at any rate, the text contained in the catalog, which Contini, together with his students Francesco Mazzoni and Giancarlo Breschi, produced to guide visitors through the exhibition space. As the catalog explains, the polarity between I più antichi, I meglio ordinati manuscripts, the oldest, the best ordered, and others arising from I vari strati sociali d'Italia, the various social strata of Italy, was to be the centro of the mostra. This conjunction, which up till now it has not been possible to present in such a visual, immediately perceptible way, constitutes the dorsal spine of the organization of display materials, and is intended not only to offer grist to the scholar or the specialist's mill, but also to move and to stimulate the man of average cultural attainments, we might say the average Italian. Dante is a popular poet and a classic, but this has to do with the fact that both the specialist and the man on the Sestri omnibus will rub shoulders on the exhibition floor. When the exhibition catalog is finished, Contini leaves on a transatlantic voyage with the essay in his luggage. The first stop is Montreal. The essay is now titled Dante, auteur populaire et classique, and he is interviewed about it on Québécois radio. A radio interviewer is able to sense the popularizing thrust of Contini's talk at this point, such a stark opposition to the later, almost untranslatable work that Calvino will read. Contini recounts in a letter to Antonio Pizzuto the Canadian interviewer's question to him on air. Monsieur le professeur, chiedeva uno dei numerosi intervistatori della radio, che cosa ne dice di Dante, poeta engagé? Ne recava l'esortazione a politicizzarsi, eccetera, eccetera? Sì, risposi io, ne ricavo un incoraggiamento all'anticonformismo. Dante a été un homme à insuccès dans le contingent. Il n'a pas craint de risquer l'impopularité. Continues Dante at this point, is a militant Dante, engagé, almost a popular hero, who is not afraid to shy away from risks even at the cost of impopularity. In May, Contini is in Malta, and then in Budapest. This version will be published in a Hungarian literary journal. This conference in Hungary is the first time that the essay is titled An Interpretation of Dante, or rather, a new interpretation of Dante. In early June, he reads Dante als Volksdichter und Klassiker before the Dante Society in Vienna. This typescript contains Contini's own emendations to the German text, largely lexical changes. I'd add to this a question that I have not settled. There is an additional English translation of the essay, which was perhaps prepared for a talk in Malta, or as an interface version from which the others were translated, or indeed, and this is not something I have yet been able to ascertain, delivered at the University of Oxford. Alongside Anna Akhmatova and Pablo Neruda, Contini was awarded an honorary doctorate from Oxford on June 9th of that year. Here is the translation from one cultural system to another point, from the English version. All of this clearly amounts to saying that men of all classes, regions, and all degrees of culture have appropriated Dante, the supreme poet of the comedy, to themselves. Monks and shopkeepers, humanists and men of the upper middle classes, from Florence and from the center of Tuscany, as well as the periphery and sometimes from beyond the Po and the Garigliano. Dante is the true unifying bond among classes, climates, and regions. This English translation is much more banal than its source, which is still the January talk, though retouched through this work of translation. But in this, however, it is especially useful for measuring the distance that the work is about to traverse. Over the summer of 1965, Contini thoroughly reworks an interpretation of Dante. He produces the version of the essay which Pasolini and Calvino read with such enthusiasm, despite the interpretive difficulties arising from its new, almost untranslatable style. With this final phase, we also happily get the fullest picture of the scholar at work. Let's try to put this process together and see if the rhythm of the work in progress can inform the stylistic coordinates with which we began. Contini's note-taking system was idiosyncratic. He used index cards to take notes, nothing bound, which he would number himself if a sequence needed to be kept. Here on the screen, you can see some of the cards that make up the catalog of repeated, similar-sounding lines in the Commedia, a component of this work from the start. There are many series of these. Here is one of the cards from the set regarding the unattributed poems mentioned, the Fiore and Detto d'Amore. The fact that these sets are distinct is suggestive. One experiment suggested another, and a catalog produced in the winter of 1964, the likely date of this run of Fiore cards, for attributional ends, was put together with another similar project carried out in another moment. We then see a set of index cards that begin to gather critical ideas. Dating is far from straightforward here, but the reason for this is that each of these points noted down on a card like this is substantially autonomous. On this card, for instance, there's an idea about the praise of Solomon from Paradiso 10 as the key to the whole Commedia. This is one of the components of the essay that was added last, only in the final version, where it appears in the concluding section. Below it is an idea about rhythm, identifying rhythm as the parameter most relevant to the catalog of internal repetitions. This idea, by contrast, is present in the earliest versions of the text, and the text that appears here on this card is most conspicuously used in the early section of an interpretation of Dante. There is then formal autonomy to each of these critical ideas, a modularness, though their presence together on the same index card suggests an intention to solder these elements into a whole. The next stage, at least ideationally, shows Contini working through and redrafting the overall shape. This document gives the outline of the argument of the January talk, the one which was then translated into so many other languages. We see the initial question, followed by Dante as a popular poet, and Dante as a classical poet. Then follows a catalog of similar sounding lines. And the major or macro difference with the summer redraft is that this kernel is buried in a much ampler argumentative project. So here, in the new flow, is the popularity argument. It has been subsumed under a number of different prior claims about the memorableness of the text, but most crucially, to the front has been appended an extended new introduction that reframes the argument in terms of Benedetto Croce's famous dichotomizing interpretation of the Commedia. The classical argument follows, and then the catalog. These have now been buried as a kernel, but you could not pull the January talk out from this middle section. It has been reworked down to every word. You may begin to see where I'm going, the Chinese boxes. The image that Calvino redeployed from the essay to describe its methodology, as he called it, reads like this. Not content to sit on the page, they load themselves down like Chinese boxes with parentheses and incidentals. There is a programmatic work of implication, of expanding outwards or super-adding successive frames around. In the summer redraft, which becomes the printed version, a conclusion is also added, the length of the preceding essay again. This is where some of the ideas, like the point about Solomon, that appeared on the index cards, finally settle. That, the preceding, is a picture of the work from a macro perspective. The drafting proceeded like this. Contini took Accademia della Crusca letterhead and drew up one more skeleton on the left-hand side. We'll follow, there are displacements of modular elements even here, and we'll follow this one. Diminuita importanza ideologica, teologica della struttura, schema popolaresco del viaggio visione sia pure variante, I think, della catarsi del doppio io. Diminished ideological, theological importance of the structure. Popular scheme of vision voyage, albeit a variant of the catharsis of the double I. We'll follow this into the drafting process. Still on Crusca letterhead, Contini composes the essay anew. Composing, he will use only the right-hand column. So successive pages look like this. Returning to the first page, what we see is that Contini composes, leaving structurally an equal quantity of blank space. This done, he works through his composition, again, placing strikeout boxes around large blocks of text. And in the space on the left blank, he rewrites what he has written, or he writes a new block of text, and this is inserted into the right. More boxes, lots of boxes. In this correct practice, he seems to repeat what Proust said of his corrections to his paperoles, his drafts, which Contini analyzed in the 40s. J'ajoute partout et je change tout. There is now a question of what happens up close, what happens textually, that so starkly reverses the translatable style of the preceding versions. Here I want to zoom in on a section of text corresponding to the element of the skeleton plan we looked at. Zooming in on the text composed first in the right-hand column. For the moment, I put this up just to give an overall idea of the extent of correction. Remember, this entire text, in turn, was struck through and then rewritten on the left. I want to discuss in summary form some systematic aspects to Contini's textual changes. Here is that same text again, now on the right, and the rewritten version on the left, which takes its place. You can see that this left-hand text too contains further corrections and variants. In this last redrafting, however, we arrive very close to the text that was finally published in Paragone. Again, I won't read it out. What changes? There is first a lexical point. This is endemic throughout. An unmarked word like diciamo stylistically becomes a stylistically marked word. Conveniamo. 4 lines down, the initial choice of a verb was corrected to si incorpora e assimila tutto tranne il filo. This then, on the left, becomes un filo che si smaltisce ma non si assimila. These lexical retouchings are especially interesting when it comes to keywords. In a different place, where Contini reused his key topic word, memorabilità, the decision is made to pull the punch and get there via an oblique synonym, autorevolezza. Lexical difficulty, then, is systematically heightened throughout, and sometimes the draft works through many synonyms. Again here, unità, attributo, aspetto. There's another systemic change, visible in the first section I put up. The cuts. The last rewrite is visibly shorter than what precedes. What has been removed are the explanations or solutions to images. The state of the text, when it is read fast or continuously, is what Contini means by the libretto image at the start here. In the first version on the right, he then employs a synonym, il filo, which isn't quite trama, plot, but comes from the same metaphorical domain. That was thought too explanatory, So the text retrenches back to il libretto dunque. On the right, there's a long explanation of how Dante differs and how he does not from authors of works of Christian ethics, from non anche qui to ma esse vivono tutte di Thu Sep. The whole section, from non to ma, the whole counterbalance is removed. Now the text reads, solo per Thu Sep. These deep cuts could have had the effect of producing a detached, staccato fragmentary style, were it not for a third programmatic tendency in Contini's corrections. This has to do with subordination. Where the cuts might potentially leave a number of sentences with a similar subject then verb order in a row, Contini intervenes to subordinate, creating a long arching syntax depending on one subject. Here, ciò non avviene certo per puntigliosità di scommessa, at first, continued come, plus a new subject, plus a new principal verb, il davanzati, etc. Contini amends in favor of quella che, so the new verb, stimolerà, depends on an antecedent in the preceding clause. This continues, a major new insertion carries on the same flow, quella che stimolerà il davanzati verso tacito, perché. Again at the end, che il poeta della commedia assegna al ritmo becomes the much more rhythmical and much more syntactically involved, la rilevanza che nella commedia viene assegnata al ritmo e per la quale. So, three initial things. Upping the lexical stakes, cutting back to single formulations, often imagistic, especially where these were followed by an involuntary explanation of some kind. And last, because the former could entail a fragmentary effect, a restructuring of parallel parts to produce extended subordination. The importance, I dare to say, which the critic assigns to rhythm. The result is heady, because the prose now reads as both a succession of heavy, ponderable shards of significance and maintains a rush of onward syntactical and logical consequence, but now bereft of outright explanations. This, at any rate, within the scope of 50-odd minutes, is the best I can do to account for Calvino's sense of intricacy and his sense of untranslatability. I'll leave you with an anecdote. Back in the 1940s, responding to an inquest on Hermeticism in the fascist journal Primato, Hermeticism was the major literary movement involving both poets and prose writers of the Italian interwar. Contini recounted a story. They say that Mallarmé, having on one occasion given a eulogy and been asked by journalists for the papers he read from, asked for them back after a moment's reflection, exclaiming, when he got a hold of them, no, let's add a bit of obscurity. The anecdote, a defense of obscurity, likewise refers to added obscurity, a public text that becomes hard to read in a second moment. Obscurity is a choice, something Mallarmé revised towards. This is already a substantial transvaluation of values. Obscurity is not a lack of clarity. It is, to coin a phrase, part of the ideal genesis of the art object. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, please stay, and can I turn it over for questions?
So, if Dante writes a libretto, then Contini is the prima donna. He's thinking that his criticism is not description, it's performance. And thus he has to do the veloce, rallentato mode of syntax himself. He has to do what Dante does to perform.
I suppose that is the kind of logical extension of what I'm saying. That there's some sort of deeper imitation in the essay. It's, of course, one wouldn't be comfortable with the idea of saying that he's imitating Dante in style exactly, but certainly he is involved with that mix of epigrammicity and kind of break or rupture. That seems.
I was just thinking about those due stati.
Yeah.
Right? And then they attempt to sort of subordinate them into this, this incredible synthesis.
Yeah. I think that's the drift of what I'm saying. Thank you. Performance, certainly. Yeah.
as you were talking, I recently watched an interview of Kirk Douglas talking about Marlon Brando as an actor. And he made an interesting comment. He said that Marlon Brando was the ruin of a generation of actors trying to imitate Marlon Brando. And that's what, I'm thinking about, not the imitators of Contini, but his legacy as a model for Italian critical prose, I think has something, there's a parallel there between the imitators of Marlon Brando and the imitators of Contini. But I wanted to ask, could you tell us a little more about how you position Contini with respect to Hermeticism? Because this sounds like, the border between criticism and poetry is very fluid here, and it's being crossed, it seems. And I'm wondering if you could contextualize a little more broadly. And then I have a second question, which is, in art historical criticism of the time, it was interesting you mentioned Longhi, the interesting drawings. There's a whole tradition of Italian scholarship around drawings as a preparatory to paintings, and there's a whole cult of drawing that's kind of analogous in some ways to the Critic of Scartafacci, and I'm wondering if there's any kind of genealogy there. So two kind of general questions just to get the conversation going.
Very interesting drawings, yeah, very, very, very interesting. On the first point, the question of whether you can say that this will not be a highly original response. Whether Contini is a Hermetic writer or not has been hashed about a lot. He said, very interesting, so the journal that was mentioned a couple of times, Primato, it got anxious about Florentine or broader Italian Hermeticism at one point and launched an inquest inviting responses to the journal on the topic of whether we should have this or not. And Contini wrote in. And that Mallarmé comment is from his submission to the journal, his reply to the inquest into Hermeticism. And it's a interesting balance. He, on the one hand, is very keen to defend authors' rights to be oblique, because he is that way himself, but for other reasons as well. On the other hand, he broadly has a negative view of Hermeticism. He thinks it's sort of spinning wheels and doesn't have a clear enough project to merit its stylistic extravagances. So it's a sort of, he uses quite a lot of images. It's a strange argument. Recapitulating Contini's arguments is not entirely straightforward, but it becomes a kind of question of religious asceticism, asceticism, there we go, at one point. The second point about Roberto Longhi. If we wanted to talk a little bit more about the content of the interpretation of Dante, Longhi is himself all over it, absolutely all over it. The specific idea in the essay of pulling out bits where Dante seems to remember himself, where he is these lines that reappear at different points in the work that seem especially characteristic of the way that this person writes, is, and I don't think I'm the first to suggest this, quite analogous to the attributional work that Roberto Longhi really put his, that really made his name. Looking for, as Longhi will call them, spie, as Contini calls them in this essay, figure, that really have the kind of the fingerprint of the poet, is essentially the method that sits behind this entire work. And so in that sense, Roberto, this is a conversation with Roberto Longhi, or even an homage to Roberto Longhi in Roberto Longhi's journal. Whether or not one could continue down that line and ask if that sort of looking for the fingerprint, the impress of a particular individual in a work of art, the work of stylistic criticism, whether or not the suggestion to go to the drafts in the archive has to do with writers, with painters' sketches. that is a really amazing idea to look into. I'm going to go looking for the possibility that is the case, because it's often said simply that Contini invents this method. He wakes up one morning and invents philologia d'autore, looking at multiple draft forms and how they suggest what an author's after. But whether there's a conversation with Longhi there must be.
If it's coming from our history, it goes back to Vasari.
It goes back to, sorry, to whom?
To Vasari.
Right.
So the whole origins of Italian art history is he's ahead of the literary method in that respect, I would say. Because if you read Vasari's lives, it's precursor to that kind of the application, the making of the work of art. How design itself is we were talking about that today in the context. It's a preparatory act to the fresco. Just conversations.
The only thing I can really add to that is this is in the 20s, late 20s, I believe. They have to be the 30s. There was an exhibition in Paris. Someone had a great idea of creating a museum of writers in which their drafts would be displayed. And so for this particular exhibition, it's the Arts et Métiers in Paris. I think it was 30, maybe it was 37, 36. I'll have to check on that. They blew up Proust's drafts as manuscripts and made wall-size exhibitions out of them. And you could tour the kind of the studios or and the scraps and papers. So there, at least, you have a very conspicuous collision of visual art and writers' drafts as a thing, and that is very clearly behind the Contini's ideas in developing this idea of philology, authorial philology. Thank you very much.
I haven't talked to what Pat was saying. I was wondering what you were exchanging between. So Contini was more a contemporary critic until his text Galleria. Then he specialized in the Roman philology, but his publication record was more contemporary literature. And when he writes his commentary to Dantismo, he interprets Dante in a modernist way. So we have this reading of Dante as a modernist author. There are some lines there, some threads in that commentary. So I was wondering if his way of writing critical prose might be connected with more than romanticism itself, the general cultural ferment at that point.
So this is a question that I would have liked to address more, honestly, in the talk is why? Why in 1965? So we've left Hermeticism behind for 20 years. Why, having made a nice accessible work that is engaging and public facing, spend all this time and effort making this other piece? If the discovery of the talk is that was a later design, not how it comes out of Contini, but a careful process, why? And I don't know if I have a very strong answer to that question. One of them is extremely banal. This is what he's famous for. This is doing a Contini. That's not good enough. The decision to turn public-facing work into what must be a restrictive high art form of criticism in a second moment in these years, I'm also fascinated by the question, what social current that connects to, what is he trying to do? And apart from the defenses of obscurity that come from frankly a prior and earlier period, there's no easy answer I can give for what is in his mind in undertaking this project in the 60s. Thanks very much for the question. The answer is I must keep looking. Yes, please.
Could the answer be suggested in a kind of reader response model, take another tack at this, by the rapturous responses that he's getting from people like Calvino and Pasolini, with which you started? And apart from the radio interview, do we know anything about the kind of replies he was getting as he was presenting it in a more popular context? And could they possibly be as glowing as the response he got from Calvino and Pasolini?
Yes, and so this is a question, it almost becomes a question of, well, well, I don't know more about the radio interview and the other responses. The letters are very helpful for these very privileged, very celebrity anecdote type responses. But a broader culture, the people who went to the welcome center for foreigners in Florence and heard this talk, what they made of it, I would absolutely love to know. I think it's worth saying that the article, the anecdote about the radio shows up in another, the Quebecois radio, shows up in another piece called Philology, Dante, Philology and Exegesis. And it's clear from both the letter to Pizzuto and in that piece that there's a auteur there. There's a sense of taking distance from that kind of mucking about with popular things. I say that because it's very easy then to fall into a kind of critical cliche about Contini that he's an aristocratic writer. I don't know that difficulty always must have that one coordinate, that it's designed to be not inaccessible and basta. But I also must say that his comments about the public, or at least the tone in which he discusses public engagement there, is not very encouraging.
Might another response be to think about the French context and the fact that Contini is very much in contact with the French literary world, and that's kind of the moment of high theory in France. So, to think of difficulty as actually not in the broader European context, not unusual in the 60s. You mentioned Barthes and Audi. That's kind of Pete Barthes. So perhaps it's more speaking. Actually, he's trying to speak outside the Italian context, even though it doesn't quite ever land in the way he might have wanted it to.
That's a very interesting point. That is a very interesting point. So another theme in Contini criticisms, insofar as that field exists, is discusses his attempts to be a European. He attends a conference just in the immediate post-war in Geneva. He reports on this conference, the first of the Rencontres Internationales de Genève, I believe it's called, a series of sort of a summit of left thinkers that happens to this day every year in Geneva, tackling a question of major political moment every year. And he reports on the conference with his reportage is called Dove va la cultura europea, or Dove va l'Europa, something like this. And so this question of an Italian-trained philologist who is attempting to break out of the seal of the Alps, speak to cultural currents and intellectual currents that come from elsewhere in Europe, and create syntheses with them. That's very clear. It's very clear in this essay. I have written about this in the past, and to cite myself too much, but some of these ideas of retracing figures have a direct lineage to French high modernism. That said, again, trying to be specific about the 60s, it's if he produces an untranslatable piece that can't go to Paris as much as Calvino would like it to, it's an interesting choice to be regionally specific again. And so the game in which French theorists could write in an impossible style and win American readers doesn't, there was no evidence of that working or even being an intention behind this particular style. So confusing is the sum.
Can I jump into another question?
Please.
I think it bears mentioning just how elegant that the move of turning Contini's own methodology onto Contini is, and I think merits applause in its own. But it makes me then wonder, to take the side of Croce, right, who would make as you said, the distinction in Dante between poesia struttura and more broadly poesia and non poesia. That what if then this methodology is more applicable to, say, critical work in that way from a Crocean perspective, right? That it could still miss the moment of poetry, as he accuses it, right? You're not looking at that moment of inspiration in poetry, but it works great for criticism, as it worked spectacularly in your presentation.
Well, thank you very much for that. But yes, it is quite possibly the case that with the piecing together of a logical argument, this maybe that shows up. That would be a larger metaphysical claim. I'm not sure that I'm comfortable putting that one out there. Why this? When you do this work of gathering together a bunch of drafts, I think the first experience, or at least my first experience with this, but I imagine it's a relative universal, is there's a lot of information, and so and it's not clearly oriented in any particular direction, and there's a very enormous amount of potentially arbitrary intervention at the beginning, especially, where you think to yourself, how will I let this mass of variants and strike-throughs and text that is on occasion barely legible suggest anything about a process that I can be sure about. With so does it work better for a critical argument? I think. Does it work better for criticism than for poets? It works very well. It's very difficult to answer that question, honestly. I don't. I think the thrust of what I was trying to say today, at any rate, is not really as much as it's possible to say that it's one thing or another. Not about the texture of the logical argument, but about a particular impression of style that was responded to very enthusiastically by other people. And in that respect, the task is analogous to what it would be with a poet. You're looking for the kind of remanagement that affects not the claim so much as the reason behind that brimming excitement. That's the best I can do to answer that question.
Contini was a poet. Have you looked at
Yes, he was a poet. I have looked at them. That's all I would say on that topic. He was a poet and a translator, importantly, of poetry as well. He has a book of translations of Hölder. This is very true.
I think it would be interesting to historicize the Critica dei Scartafacci itself. I mean, it seems like its day has passed, would you say? I mean, if we look at the Italian critical environment, your opening remarks reminded me of my professor, was Freddie Capelli, and he would explicitly, I do stilistic criticism, and it works, and I'm going to keep doing it. And in fact, if you look at his very considerable contributions, they're all about Petrarch and variantistica was one thing. That's what he used to do with us. But he was also a linguist. He was a student of Midrorini, so lingua di Machiavelli, very much coming out of this tradition. And at the time, there was Segre on the Ariosto, and the Petrarch, I think. Is it exhausted? No, we're still doing it with the Trionfi, still to be done. I'm just throwing it out there as a question. What's your assessment of the Critic dei Scartafacci? It seems like you're migrating it to the Critic now, but I'm wondering what's the status of it as a methodology in the Italian environment currently? Can you think of? Can you tell us a little more about what's going on with that?
The Italian environment in particular. Maybe I'll answer that in a second moment. More broadly, attention, even in writing this piece, a question you ask yourself when you see images like this, basically, like any of these, is like, oh God, is he going to tell me about this? And is he going to focus on syntactical changes and lexical choices for 15 minutes. It's not very engaging. If I had jumped in with this, I think there would have been an exodus out the back. And so, more broadly and more seriously, I think one of the difficulties with doing this kind of work is that you can feel as though you're getting, that style becomes a siloed question of authorial remanagement, and you can't talk about. I tried very hard in this talk to talk about the radio interview, the traveling to Canada, because doing stylistic criticism that has stakes in outside of this is not entirely easy to do. And so I think that is probably what is more than anything responsible for the relative demise of, as questions about literature's more, to put it in a banal way, its social value become more and more important. Work like this almost necessarily becomes less and less perhaps immediately enticing. That said, that's not fair. It shouldn't be that way. That was not Spitzer's point. That's not Contini's point. The point is we should, ideally, be able to look at small changes in the value of stylistic coordinates and explain what social or broader context is responsible for those repositionings. But that's very challenging work. Initially, I don't know if I could come up with a single way of summarizing what the status of this is. Of course, so some of what I said today, including the synopsis of the battle with Croce about this method of proceeding, would be taught in the second year of an undergraduate course. That's part of the annals of the discipline that is taught, and so one would know, usually from the perspective of Contini's relative victory, that this is a valuable way of studying literature. That said, I don't know. That doesn't necessarily mean that the use that's made of that history is got the same sort of steel critique ambitions, the same kind of literary critical ambitions that were very much a part of the project in the 50s and 60s.
That might be a very good place to conclude. Maybe we can thank our speaker. I hope we can continue the conversation more informally, off camera, and let's say all together. So, thank you.
Thank you.